The heat tonight focusing on the tragic events in Nice in France. But first, there appears to be breaking news coming out of Turkey. A coup appears to be underway in that country. At this stage, there are very confusing reports coming out of there. What we do know now is that the military has broken into two factions, one that supports the coup and the other that supports the government. Well, with me in the studio right now is Kamran Bukhari, a foreign policy consultant. And Kamran, what are you hearing about these events in Turkey?
You're absolutely right. The military doesn't seem to be coherent. So this is not your typical Turkish military coup where the armed forces, the Turkish armed forces, the TSK, overthrows the government and takes over. This is a much more confusing situation where you have, as you mentioned, battling it out with each other. Special forces are on one side. The intelligence agency seems divided. There are clashes between police and the army. The first army within the Turkish armed forces, its commander, the army doesn't support the coup, but it's unclear who exactly are the coup makers, who are the leaders of this coup attempt.
Right, the information I've been hearing, getting from our reporters out in Turkey, is that one faction of the army, and that is the Air Force, and a group that patrols the rural parts of Turkey form one faction, and then the army or the infantry form the other faction. If we look at these factions in that way, there is a potential for bloodshed and violence here.
There is, and that potential for bloodshed and violence goes up because the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is calling people onto the streets.
Right.
Other political parties are mobilizing and issuing statements against the coup. And as you said, the military is divided. So this could, has a potential civil war type of scenario, but I don't want to jump the gun yet.
Right, and looking at the pictures coming out of Turkey, it appears that people are heeding that call by Erdogan to get out onto the street. We see people on the streets gathering in public squares, which is what he called for, as well as at the airport. One other question I have very quickly before we get on to the events in France, and that is, what would have motivated the military to stage this coup?
It's really unclear because, as you said, there are elements within the military who did this. Usually, coups are very well organized. They don't take a whole lot of time, and they're executed with, speed and efficiency. It seems like this is much more haphazard. No motivation could be anything. It could be an attempt at power struggle. It could be that there is a strong faction within the military that sees this current government as not pursuing the interests of the country with regards to the Kurds, ISIS, and just the whole idea of how Erdogan is, has been amassing power.
Okay, well, this, of course, will be unfolding through the hours ahead, through the days ahead, in Turkey, and we'll be following it very closely. Let's get on to our topic on the heat this evening, and that is the events in France, in Nice. Witnesses describing a scene of horror there as a truck driver ran down people on a main street in the south of France, in the city of Nice. For the latest from France, we're joined now by CCTV's Kevin Osbeck in Nice. And Kevin, what do we know right now? What can you tell us about President Hollande? François Hollande visited the city today. What was that about?
Well, he came here to Nice to pay his respect for the tragedy that this city is now trying to comprehend and is trying to cope with. He also did say, since this attack all unfolded Thursday night here in this Mediterranean seaside town, that France is facing a now constant threat from radical Islamist terrorism. And he did then make a number of actions, including extending this state of emergency. Now, that state of emergency has been in place here in France ever since the November Paris attacks of last year. It's very important when it comes to police work here in France if that state of emergency is under effect, because when this country is under a state of emergency, police have more power. One of those additional powers they have is they can search homes, they can raid homes without a search warrant signed off from a judge. So the reason President Hollande extended that state of emergency is to help aid in this investigation.
And what is the security situation like in Nice right now? What is the mood like in that city?
Well, there's a very heavy police presence here, but really there was a heavy police presence here even before all that chaos and carnage unfolded Thursday evening. And that's because there's been a heavy police presence all across this country ever since, once again, those November Paris attacks. And just a few weeks ago, there was the big Euro 2016 football tournament. There were matches, football matches being held simultaneously in multiple French cities. So much security planning and so many security forces were dispatched and were working to make sure those games stayed safe. Those games did in fact stay safe. There were no major incidents, even though we know that the Brussels cell behind both the Paris attacks and the Brussels attacks did have an intent, did have the Euro 2016 as one of their targets. So in one way, this country breathed a huge sigh of relief when that final football match was played just a few Sundays ago, then only to have this tragedy all unfold here Thursday night. It caught many people here, not just in Nice, but all across this country, quite off guard to see what happened here.
Okay, thank you. This is Kevin Osbeck reporting from Nice in France. Now let's get to our panel. Kamran Bukhari is still with us in the studio. He's a senior fellow with the Center for Global Policy and fellow with George Washington University's program on extremism. Joining us from Paris, Joao Toca is a professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. He specializes in security and global communications. From Maine, Lauren Anderson is a former legal attaché for the FBI field office in Paris. She now is an international security expert. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's go directly to Paris. And Joao, this is the third major attack in France in 18 months. The country is in mourning again, if not in shock. What kind of impact is this having on the country?
Well, you may imagine confusion, there's sadness, there's fear, and there's something which is new in comparison to those traumatic experiences which the country has gone through in November 2015 and in January 2015 and over the last year and a half or so, namely, which used to be the immediate national reflex, supported, of course, by political leaders, that of unity, that of cohesion, that of solidity facing the challenge, seems to be softer or weaker this time. You can hear voices, and not only amongst opposition leaders, including among those individuals in political power and elsewhere, who are more or less associated with the Socialist Party and the left-wing coalition which is in power, which says, after all, have we done everything which we could have been done? Haven't we just been too relaxed precisely for the reason your correspondent down from Nice just mentioned? The fact that the challenge of the Euro 2016, the football tournament, which was over last Sunday, actually had gone through peacefully or correctly, in spite of the anxiety which had surrounded it. And then 5 days later, on the Bastille Day, the national holiday of France, this horrible massacre in Nice.
Okay. Lauren, we have one of the witnesses to this attack in Nice. Let's take a listen and watch this.
All ages there, all nationalities, all races, everybody having a great time. The fireworks display had just finished. We were actually just heading back to our apartment. Just stopped to enjoy one of the bands that was playing on the promenade, and then we turned to hear lots of commotion and shrieking and shouting, and then we saw a truck coming down the promenade, probably 30 or 40 miles per hour, careering from side to side.
So here we have this horrendous attack in Nice in France. Lauren, the question is, why France? Why has France been targeted so many times? Okay, Lauren, we have a problem. We can't hear you. We'll try and get that fixed. And while we're trying to get that fixed, let me go to Kamran. Kamran, I want you to listen to what the French prosecutor said about the attacker. The attacker was identified shortly after the killings in Paris, and this is what the prosecutor had to say. Let's listen.
Parmi ces victimes, il y a Among these victims, there are French. There are also a lot of foreigners from all continents, and there are many children, young children, who came to see fireworks with their families, to be happy, to share in something joyous, something dazzling, and were also struck dead, to satisfy the cruelty of an individual and maybe a group.
Okay, of course, that was not the French prosecutor, that was the French president, François Hollande, talking about the attack there. We don't know what the motivation for this attack was. We don't know whether it was just an individual carrying out this attack or whether he had the support of another, there was a group there. Does it surprise you that no group has claimed responsibility for this?
No, it hasn't. I mean, there is a lag sometimes if ISIS claims responsibility. Sometimes they don't, as in the case of San Bernardino. It didn't take responsibility. It just said, you know, we approve of it. So so maybe it's just too early, and then the events of Turkey have taken over as well. So it's not really clear what's going on. As for the motivations, it's really unclear. There's all sorts of information. This individual was going through a divorce, has 3 children. You know, he reportedly never went to a mosque. So it's really unclear. But that doesn't mean he can't be radicalized. He could have been radicalized, very likely. But the key thing that we're seeing now, which is far more important than anything else, is that we have a situation where there are just one too many attacks.
Okay, and at this stage we're going to have to interrupt our show. We're going to go now to our newsroom to continue rolling coverage on the events taking place in Turkey right now. First a break, then that coverage on Turkey.